Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're in Tiebreakers, the 2016 World Chess Championship. Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karjakin, they played 12 games, and at the end of it, they are tied. So we come to the Tiebreakers. It's actually Magnus Carlsen's birthday, so what better way for him to celebrate his birthday than if he could actually win the World Championship. So the formats, if you are not familiar, we start with 4 games of Rapid Chess. Rapid Chess, we're going to be looking at 25 minutes for each player, and then they do get a 10-second increment on each of their moves. And if after 4 games they are still tied, which is very reasonable with these players, then we go into more of a blitz style where they get 5 minutes each, and then 3 seconds are going to be added on. If there's still a tie after that round, then we get into an Armageddon session, which if we need to, we'll explain that in another video as well. But in this video, we're going to be looking at the rapid portion. We are not going to be going over games 1 and 2, mostly because they both ended in draws, and they were pretty much the same games we've seen before. As you'll kind of see, even with game 3, which we're going to be starting to look at right now, it doesn't seem like their preparation really entailed much different for this rapid section than they have been throughout the tournament, because you're seeing a lot of the same openings. So this game number 3, White's going to be played by Sergei Karjakin. Carlsen drew the black pieces for game 1, which means he has the white pieces in games 2 and 4, so he will get to close this out. So even if he were to lose this game, he does get the white pieces in game 4. But we'll go ahead and get started with Sergei Karjakin in game 3, all tied up. Starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, same as we've seen for most of the tournament. Bishop to b5, and then getting into the Morphy defense, pawn to a6, bishop back here to a4. Knight f6, castle on the king side, bishop e7, and then pawn to d3. So this is the opening that we saw in game 2 from Sergei Karjakin, game 4, game 11, and game 1 in this tiebreaker that we're not going over right now. Played the exact same thing. So his preparation is very, very focused on this opening. That's what he feels comfortable with, so that's what we are going with. Pawn here to b5, bishop back to b3. All these moves are identical to what we've seen so far in the tournament. Pawn to d6, pawn a3, castle on the king side, knight to c3, and then knight to a5. And this has really been the key difference as far as how Magnus Carlsen has changed up his play. Before, we've seen knight to a5. That was kind of in that game number 2. Then we saw bishop to e6 a little bit later. In game 1 of the tiebreaker, we actually saw the knight coming back here to b8, which was interesting, but just preparing for the pawn to push forward here to c5. But continues with the knight to a5, attacking the bishop here on b3. Bishop comes back to a2, and then bishop to e6. Now, in the previous game, as we saw this exact same position, from right here, it was kind of pawn to d4, saying, hey, I know you're going to take my bishop, so I'm going to go ahead and start to attack the center of the board. So Karjakin decides, okay, I've done my preparation. I didn't like how that ended up, so I'm going to change things up and play pawn to b4, attacking your knight. Magnus Carlsen brings his knight back here to c6, and then knight to d5. So all of a sudden, we have a different game here, and with less time on the clock, it'll be interesting to see who kind of comes out of this preparation ahead. Knight here to d4, nice little outpost move. Knight to g5, just being pretty proactive from Karjakin. Bishop takes on d5, and then the pawn recaptures. Knight back here to d7. So all of a sudden, Karjakin has the double bishop pair. All of a sudden, we see double pawns in the d file for Karjakin. So I'd say all in all, pretty even. And Magnus Carlsen has a few options here. He could bring his knight over here to d7, push forward with his pawn to f5, start to attack on the king side. He could play more of a pawn to c6, and then after pawn takes here on c6, he could recapture with his knight. Play more defensively, in my opinion. So decided to play a little bit more aggressive, and I think that was his kind of plan for most of the end of the 12 rounds. Is he knew that he could be pretty aggressive in the rapid chess, just because I think he's a stronger player overall than Sergei Karjakin. So plays knight to d7, and then after knight to e4, then starts to push forward with pawn to f5. Karjakin moves his knight back here to d2, kind of blocking off some of his development for his other pieces, but really wants to kind of maneuver this somewhere else. Pawn to f4, so starting to push his advantage on the king side is Magnus Carlsen. Pawn up here to c3, forcing the knight back here to f4, and then knight here to e4. And this is a really good square for Karjakin's knight. Since Magnus Carlsen doesn't have his light square bishop, he essentially is going to need to trade off, and then he can no longer have double pawn structure on the d file. So all in all, really good square for this knight here on e4. Queen here to e8, just getting ready to get over to the king side of the board if he wants to. Pawn up here to b3. I really don't like pawn to b3. I was looking to push forward so he doesn't have, his bishop kind of in the way of this rook to protect it. But I think Magnus Carlsen's putting enough pressure on the king side of the board that he should really try to get some of his material involved into the king side to kind of protect the house over here. And then if he wants to push on the queen side, he can do that. Maybe try to open up the a file, get his rooks involved. But even queen to g4 sounds good. I think he needs some of that big material. And the queen can't be forced off by light square bishops. I think that's kind of the play I prefer. But bishop to b3, queen here to g6, a pawn to f3. This, I think, also is somewhat questionable. I think this blocks off getting his pieces into the game. He's not going to get his dark square bishop. He's not going to move over here. His queen is now kind of blocked off. It does open up the door for the dark square bishop, which Magnus Carlsen has to attack this king. The king can always come here to h1. That's fine. But starting to add pressure on the king side, and Karjakin is going to say, I'm going to block this off, try to hold down the fort with what I have, and then start to attack on the queen side. So bishop down here to h4, and then pawn to a4. So as we said before, Karjakin can't do too much else, so decides, let's go and attack over here. A knight here to f6, a queen here to e2, and then we start to see some exchange on the queen side of the board. Pawn recaptures, bishop here to d2. After the bishop takes on c3. I think this is going to be okay for Sergei Karjakin. Comes out with the double bishop pair. All he really needs to do is control this a file, get a rook behind enemy lines. He does have this backward pawn here on this c7 square. If he can start to attack this, really control the 7th rank, I think Karjakin's going to have a pretty good game. Magnus Carlsen needs to make a choice. Continue to try to attack on the king side of the board. He may need to get another pawn involved, or at least a rook involved into the game to really break through. Or he needs to focus his energy, try to get an outpost here on d4, put more pressure. Even here on e3 would be good. Start to put pressure on some of the critical squares on the queen side, and then see if he can, in fact, take over on the queen side of the board. Knight here to e3, so decides that's the outpost that he wants to go with. A rook over here to c1. We just see an exchange on board, and then queen here to e8. So Magnus Carlsen looking like he's kind of abandoning the king side of the board, getting his queen over here, starting to attack on the queen side. First attacking this pawn on b5, pretty easy to defend with bishop to c4. But he wants his opponent to be in defense mode. He doesn't want these bishops to be very active. He wants them to be defending. King here to h8, doesn't want some sort of weird exchange where the pawn comes off and then the bishop's attacking it with a gain in tempo. Knight takes, bishop recaptures, rook up here to a3, and then pawn to e4, just opening up the door a little bit for this dark square bishop to get involved into the game. The bishop captures, rook takes over here on c3, and then queen down here to e5. Also, nice little square for this queen in the center of the board. We always talk about outposts with minor pieces, typically knights, sometimes bishops, but queens can be pretty powerful as well. The light square bishop's not going to be able to ever attack this. This rook really is never going to be able to put pressure on this. The queen could try to have a defender and then attack this, but it just gets somewhat awkward. So all in all, this queen can get involved into the game if he wants to. Easily, quick move over to the queen side of the board, get behind enemy lines. So Karjakin, I would say, is kind of in a tough spot now. He has to play somewhat defensively, especially with this very active knight on this e3 outpost with his light square bishop not doing too much. All Magnus Carlsen really needs to do is start to get his rook involved into the game. He can have a pretty strong attack on board. Karjakin moves rook down here to c1, rook over here to a8. Magnus Carlsen getting that rook involved into the game. Pawn to h3, just allowing his king a little safety net if he needs to move. Same thing with pawn to h6. Both sides recognize that at any time there could be a queen or rook getting into this back rank. Wants to make sure nothing crazy happens. Queen here to d4, just centralizing a little bit more. Queen down here to e1, completely in defense mode right now. Queen to b2, starting to put pressure. You can see specifically on this square on g2, threatening mate in 1 right here. Bishop apps come back to f1, exactly what Magnus Carlsen's looking for, playing straight defense from white. Rook down here to a2, and then kind of a fatal error by Karjakin. He looks at this and decides to play rook up here to c7. Capture material. Kudos to white for capture material. Unfortunately, he loses the game after rook here to a1. In this particular spot, Karjakin was forced to resign. He's just going to, it doesn't really matter what he tries to do. That obvious, if he gets his queen out of the way, he's going to lose his queen. He really just need to take care on a1, but then he's just going to lose that. If he tries something, queen to h4, because it dies here on f2 or g3, then all of a sudden, knight to f2 or f1 check, kind of forcing the king can't come here. Doesn't matter where it kind of comes to. Then all of a sudden the knight comes back. This is all going to lose. Queen to g2. That's going to be mate. Doesn't matter if the rook comes back down. It's still going to fall because the queen's protecting the square here on c1. So all in all, Karjakin very quickly realized he had made a huge blunder and loses this one. So he has a tough task going into game number 4. He's playing the black pieces against Magnus Carlsen, who's now up a game. Magnus Carlsen, if he can draw or win game number 4, then he will be the champion. So let's go ahead and get into game number 4. Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces. All he needs is a tie. Victory would also suffice to be the world champion and win it on his birthday. Sergei Karjakin does need a victory to get on to the blitz portion and tie things up with Magnus Carlsen. So let's go ahead and get started. Pawn to e4, Magnus Carlsen, kind of what we expected. Pawn to c5, so the Sicilian defense, probably the sharpest line to actually have some sort of chance from black. Thought we'd see actually more of the Sicilian defense. There's just so many variations that both sides could have prepared for. But we didn't. We saw mostly just pawn to e5. It seemed like both sides really prepared for that. Knight to f3, pawn to d6, and then after exchanging the center of the board, which we typically see from the Sicilian defense, we see pawn to f3. Not a variation we see very often. It's the Prince variation. Still allowing himself to play pawn to c4, but it does kind of expose his king a little bit. Usually going to be castling on the king side when you're playing the Sicilian defense. Don't want to open up the door, castle on the queen side to have all this pressure from your opponent, opening up, semi-open file on the c file for the rook to come down and attack. So all in all, this is a pretty aggressive opening, I think, for Magnus Carlsen, because he could just play extremely passive, try to exchange off material super quickly and get a draw. But it decides, okay, let's go out with a bang here. So after f3, we see pawn to e5, forcing the knight to come back here. Bishop to f7, or e7, and then pawn up here to c4. And he had lots of different options here. Could have played knight to c3, just development move. That's pretty common. Bishop to b5, check. Bishop to even c4, putting pressure on these light squares also makes a lot of sense, but decided to go with the pawn here to c4. Pawn to a5, really expected an immediately pawn to a4, just because they don't have much time. So any of these obvious moves you just kind of expect. Magnus Carlsen played bishop to e3. So if you were watching along and it was playing the what is this person going to play, which if you're playing a very long game, it somewhat can be very difficult unless you're using computer assistants to figure out where they're going to go. But if you just look at on the board and try to put your shoes in, Magnus Carlsen's spot, it can be very difficult. But over a blitz game, sometimes they play over the board. They don't really like long calculations because if there's ever some sort of error, it kind of goes badly for them. And so they just kind of play the obvious move. So kind of just expected pawn to a4. Magnus Carlsen looks like he's prepared this variation because he played bishop to e3 without really thinking too much. Pawn to a4, forcing the knight. Knight comes back here to c1. It's a fairly interesting castle on the king side. Knight up here to c3. Queen down here to a5. So on the 10th move, Sergei Karjakin decides to go ahead his queen involved into the game. And this was kind of what I was hoping to see from Sergey throughout the tournament, being somewhat aggressive, trying to put Magnus Carlsen in some tough spots, even with the black pieces. Hadn't really done that too much, but all of a sudden, in rapid chess, which makes sense, is getting his queen involved very early on to the action. Queen up here to d2, stopping that pin, so he can move his knight if he wants to. Knight to a6, could have brought it here to c6, probably the more common move. Knight c6, knight down here to d4, nice little outpost, but decides to bring it first to a6, bring it here to c5 eventually. Could then bring it to e6, start to attack on the king side of the board, so kind of has some options there. Bishop to e2, getting ready to castle on the king side. Knight to c5 castle, and then bishop to d7. So completing development for the most part. Magnus Carlsen's complete development. He's moved his knight enough to kind of count that as complete development. Rook here to b1. Just protecting this pawn a little bit if it wants to push up a little bit on board. Rook over here to c8. So does have the semi-open file here. Magnus Carlsen has semi-open file on this d file, so he eventually will want to bring a rook over here to d1, put a lot of pressure on the d file. But Sergei Karjakin says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring my rook over here to start to add pressure on this c file. Magnus continues with pawn up here to b4, and then the pawn's kind of forced to take. And this is actually a legal move en passant. Once the pawn comes up here next to the pawn, it does have one move to go ahead and take diagonally like this. This does force, after the pawn takes, kind of the queen to come back here. You don't want the pawn to come up and now force one of these pieces to go by the wayside. But instead of the queen going back, I almost wish you would have played knight to e6, still keeping the queen involved into the action, but decided that the queen wasn't doing what he wanted to right now, so brought it back here to d8. Knight here to d3, just getting it more involved into the center of the board. Knight back here e6. Knight to b4, just both sides positioning a little bit. Bishop to c6, and then rook over here to d1. And this is kind of that obvious move. He did have the option, I think, if he had more time to calculate, he may have played knight to d5. After the exchange on board, bishop takes, pawn recaptures, knight down here to d4. After the exchange, we see the queen up here. I think white's going to be in a much better position in this particular spot. Is up a pawn, controlling the center of the board. I think that's going to be good. But too long of a calculation, I think. He played the obvious and still very good move. Rook over here to d1, controlling this semi-open file. A pawn to h5, bishop down here to f1. A pawn to h4, just pushing a little bit. Queen over here to f2, just protecting that a little bit. Knight to d7, opening up the door for the bishop and the queen to both protect this pawn. And then pawn to g3. I thought g3 was somewhat interesting on board. Not really worried about protecting the king side of the board right now. Sergei Karjakin has the option to kind of blow this up. Pawn takes, pawn recaptures. You can still protect it, but it's a little bit exposed for my liking in a rapid game. I know that Sergei Karjakin can start to point a lot of his material on the king side of the board. It's probably easier in this spot instead of playing pawn to g3, just knight up here to c6. Start to exchange material on board. All Magnus Carlsen really needs is a draw. So knight back here to d7 and then pawn up to g3. I say for the most part, Sergei Karjakin's done a good job of keeping material on board, putting some somewhat interesting positions. He doesn't necessarily have an advantage, but at least he's giving himself a shot, not really trying to exchange material too much off the board. So later on, Magnus Carlsen easily starts running out of time, can make a mistake in this game. Rook down to a3, starting to attack on the queen side of the board. A bishop to h3. Rook over to a8, knight down here, c2. Both sides just maneuvering a little bit on the board. We do see knight coming back here to c2. Eventually, we see pawn to b6, so pushing a little bit. A rook to d2, protecting. Queen c7, rook over here, d1. So starting to add more pressure on this central file, the d file. Bishop to f8. Both sides not really doing too much. I thought it was interesting the bishop move to f8, losing the protection of the pawn here on h4. Because then after, the knight comes down here to f4, after the bishop takes, then it gets kind of awkward. Queen to d7, knight up here to b4. Ideally, Sergei Karjakin would like to play bishop to e7 to start to attack, this pawn right here. get his queen involved to kind of protect it from, this queen as well. But he just kind of loses too much time here. Knight takes on c6 after the queen takes. Knight up here to d5, attacking the bishop after the bishop moves. Then all of a sudden the knight can come over here, take material on f4. Black's just down too much material. So he kind of looked at it and recognized correctly that after the knight came up here, to b4, he recognized, hey, something's going on. Even if he didn't have time to calculate everything, he probably realized it was going to use too much time to play bishop to e7, start to attack this pawn. He said, hey, I'll give it up. I need to start to understand what's going on the queen side of the board. Played rook here to a3. Now the knight takes on c6. Knight recaptures, knight up here to b5. So this is a nice little outpost on the light square. Dark square bishop not going to really be able to chase this off the board. Attacking the rook right here. Rook is forced to move. Takes here on b3. Comes back to d4, attacking the queen. But then he decides, okay, we're going to go ahead and have an exchange on board, attacking your queen and your rook. I'm going to go ahead and take your rook. Sergei Karjakin says, I have to try something, so I'm going to have a pawn advantage. I'm going to have a pass pawn on the b file, and I'm going to give up that rook. This is a very difficult in-game, all things considered. If they had tons of time, Magnus Carlsen wins this pretty much 95 times out of 100 just because 2 rooks against just rook, bishop, an extra pawn. Not really doing too much for him, but sometimes you got to go all out to try to just add pressure and see if your opponent makes a mistake. So after the queen takes, we do have the double rook versus the rook and the bishop in game. Queen here to e2, bishop e7, attacking this pawn. And then queen up to e6 does get a little bit tricky if he were to decide to come down here and take on h4, just because he starts to give up material in the center of the board, which he doesn't really want to do on board. Karjakin continues queen to e6, pawn h5, pushing it on the king side. Rook down here, a3. Rook up here to d3 says, hey, if you want to exchange equal material, that's going to be completely fine with me. Karjakin decides that's not the path he wants to go down. Magnus Carlsen, they kind of dance around a little bit. Karjakin decides, okay, we can't have a draw, so decides to bring his rook back here to a7. Rook up here, d5. Rook over here to c7. Queen down here, d2. Queen f6, and then rook to f5. Continuing to put pressure. He recognizes that he can't get too carried away. He can't just start taking rook to d6, hoping that his opponent's going to start exchanging here, because he always has an exposed king. So queen down to g5, check. You can see the king move. Bishop takes if the queen takes. All of a sudden, queen to h5. And then we're kind of equal in material, except there is kind of this extra pawn that's going to fall. So all things considered, this is just not going to be exactly what Magnus Carlsen is looking for, since he just has better material on board. So instead, decides to go ahead and add pressure with rook over here to f5. Queen down here, h4. Rook to c1, says, hey, let's go ahead and exchange on board. Karjakin trying everything he can. He's slowly dwindling in material. Rook over here to a7. Queen to f4 says, let's exchange queens off board. There is a check, so king down here to h1. Queen down here to f2, and this is somewhat all she wrote. Rook to c8. King to h7, and then there's a nice little deflection move with queen to h6, and there's no way to stop this, and so in this particular spot, he resigned. If he were to take with his king, then all of a sudden, that's going to lose to just the rook over here, h8, and if for some reason he decided to take with his pawn, I think you just play rook up here to f7, checkmate as well. So Karjakin resigns. Magnus Carlsen is the world champion yet again. Ends up winning game 3 with the black pieces and game 4 with the white pieces as well. So was kind of glad that Magnus Carlsen tried to play somewhat aggressive. I think he played a pretty interesting opening that gave himself some solid chances. I think he was more prepared for that than Sergei Karjakin. So all in all, congratulations to the champion. This does make sense why he ended up playing so drawish in game 12. He just felt really confident in his speed chess. So all in all, fantastic tournament. We got some extra games in. All in all, 14 games. So hopefully you enjoyed the coverage. And until next time, thanks for watching. Appreciate the support of the channel. See you guys then.